So let's talk about hidden bales on silver clay or any metal clay pieces. So when I say a hidden bale, I mean a little arch that's hidden on the back so you can't see the bale, and it's where your chain or your cord goes through. I'm a big fan on having two on the back of pieces because I find it helps the piece balance better when it's being worn. You can have one. I've got the piece on the far right showing that's just got one, and that's because that piece is actually relatively light. The pieces on the left hand side have a little flower that's not central, so if I only had one bale, that side would be dragging down a little bit. So I tend to add two bales if the piece is heavy or I want it to sit at a very specific angle. So the process of making these little hidden bales is actually really simple, and I will run through my entire process now. So what I'm using is a playing card, a couple of shapes to put my arches over, and some sticky tack. So these two shapes are a black plastic drinking straw. It's a stirring straw, I think, in America, which is 20 ml, and a piece of brass tubing, which is 40 ml. So I use the poster tack, the blue tack, to stick these to the playing card, and that's just to anchor them in place because I'm going to be making my arches over the top. Once it's stuck down, I pick it up to see what the clearance is like between the straw and the card. I don't want it to be sitting right next to the card. That space is quite deep, but that's fine. I'm going to let that be. You do want a little bit of space because you want to make an arch, not just like a semicircle shape. So you do want to have kind of a little bit of space for the walls either side of the curve that makes the arch. So I'm just going to stick down the brass one as well, and then check that this is looking good. And that's a little bit closer, but that's absolutely fine. So I'm going to push that off to one side. Now I've made those, and I'm going to get on with rolling my clay. I like to roll inside a plastic folder, which is just a plastic bag with the sides cut. I just find it keeps my clay clean. It was a tip that one retanner gave me. And I'm rolling out a really small piece of clay. My frame is a 2, it's a 0.5 ml or 2 playing cards. And I've literally just rolled a nice long strip. That's all I need. So I'm going to use a tissue blade and strip cutters. I've got a bit of cool slip to run the blade through, just so to make sure it's not going to stick to my clay. Don't want too much on there, so I'm just wiping the excess off. And I just want to straighten up these long edges. These are actually going to be the edges that sit against the clay piece, so at the ends of your bale arches. And I've just popped that back into its cling film because I want to make sure it's not drying out. I'm just eyeballing the width. I'm trying to go for about 10 ml. It's totally, which 1 centimetre, it's totally up to you, and if you want to measure it, by all means do. I do this so regularly, I've got to the point where I'm eyeballing it and I can make it work. But by all means, make your measurements a bit more precise. So now I've cut that strip, I'm going to grab my strip cutters. I will link to where I bought these. They are from the UK, and I'm running them through the cool slip as well, and I'm just going to press them down on the clay at a right angle and getting it as accurate as possible. I wiggled them a bit before releasing them just to make sure that these little strips are going to release. But you'll see this happens quite often, that the one in the middle, the line in the middle doesn't detach. So I'm just going to gently run the tissue blade in between them, and they come apart pretty easily. So I'm grabbing my playing card that's got my tubes sitting on it, so it's close to hand, and I'm going to grab a paintbrush, and I'm going to use my tissue blade as well to help me get these little shapes onto the tubes. So I usually pick one up. I'll fold the plastic back over the rest just to keep it dry. I usually pick one up with my tissue blade. I apologise for being slightly out of shot at this point. And I use my finger resting against one side, and I'm pressing down on the other side with the paintbrush. Sometimes I'll use a paintbrush because it makes it easier. Sometimes I'll just work with my fingers. I tend to find I'm fairly good at this, which is surprising that I don't dig my fingernails in, because I do have fairly long fingernails. But I've just bent it over, and what I want to make sure, and when I was picking the card up then, I was just making sure that the two ends are level. They're not right down at the card, that's fine, but I want them level. And now I'm just taking an extra bit of poster tack or blue tack, and I'm going to, my blue tack is very sticky, it wanted to stick to my fingers as much as the card. I don't want it to be pushing on the arch, I want it to be sitting next to it. So it's just holding the clay in place, because if you have used silver clay before, you'll know that these little arches, the little ends start flaring outwards as the clay dries and contracts. So by doing this, you just stop that happening and you end up getting a nice perfect arch shape. The nice thing about using strip cutters is that you get an even width to your bales. So if you're putting two on the same piece, it's nice to know they're exactly the same size. You can obviously make them a lot thicker or wider. It's totally up to you. You can make them 3 cards thick, 4 cards thick, whatever suits you. I find 2 cards works really well for a bale. As long as they have been fired correctly and they're sintered, they're as strong as you need them to be. I've never had one fall off. But at 2 cards, you have got to be a little bit careful with how you are making these, so you don't essentially smush the clay onto the straw or your tube. And you see I'm just adding this, I'm pushing kind of the sticky tack up against the side of the clay. I will use my paintbrush just to help me replace it so it's even and not sitting at an angle over the tube. I'm going to check any time that I've placed one of these bales, and you can just see I'm using the exact same type of strip to make one of the bales over the thicker, the wider 40mm tube. I do keep picking up the card to make sure these little silver clay pieces are even, and I'm using my paintbrush a lot to make sure that they are level. And only when I'm happy that they are level, and I am quite pedantic about this, I do spend time to make sure I get these shapes right, because even though they're hidden, they're still on your piece and you want to make sure that you're making them nicely. Then I am putting my 2 little pieces of tack in place to hold it. Once I've placed as many bales as I want to make on this card, I'll leave it to air dry overnight. So the final thing I wanted to say before this video finishes is that occasionally the clay gets stuck in these strip cutters. And so I use a paintbrush, and you'll see that these two stuck together a little bit. So I just got the back of the paintbrush, just ran it down that middle strip, and then I can just tease these little pieces out so you don't ruin them. You can just gently tease them out a little bit, and there we go, they're ready to use.